Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good midday. Thanks for joining. Thanks for joining, guys. We'll just wait for everyone to log on. We'll give people a couple of minutes. Hopefully, gives you a moment to get used to Zoom if you've used it before. There are a couple of just housekeeping points. You're automatically on mute, so if you want to share and talk, then please unmute yourself first. We'll do that as we go. There's a poll to just work out how we're feeling today. So before we get into it, how's everyone coping with the crisis? Are we actually embracing the kind of the time that we've got now at home, finding some other hobbies that we didn't have before, perhaps? Or are we still struggling? Like, whereabouts are we? And one of the key things for leaders as well is making sure we're checking on ourselves first. So putting our own oxygen mask on, if you like, before we're able to help our teams. So great to see we've got 4 people smashing it, 5 making the most of it, a couple of grimaces, and a couple of people perhaps all over the place. That's okay. We're probably going to have a mix of people as we go through it. That's kind of normal in these circumstances. Right before,
can I chip in?
Please do, Lizzie.
Just if anyone can't see that poll and it didn't pop up automatically, if you look at the bottom of your screen, then you might have an option to press a button poll, and that will pop up then.
Brilliant. Yep. And along that bar, there is also a raise hand button. So if you want to ask a question, I'll try and keep an eye on everyone, and we'll filter it that way. We'll have loads of time for questions at the end. We're going to have half the time for this webinar will be questions from the audience for our esteemed sort of panel that we've gathered today. And there's also other reactions, so thumbs up and claps. And if there are various points that really resonate, I encourage you to kind of get stuck in with those. Brilliant. So just before we get into all the introductions, this is the first in a series of webinars that we're hosting from Hoxby as a part of our Remote Against Coronavirus campaign. They'll usually be on the Fridays, so just look out for an email after this. We'll give you details of the next one, but given the Easter weekend, we're here on a Thursday. And just before we get started, I want to share a quick story to position just how important we think this topic is. So if we go back to 1760, and you've got hundreds of thousands of workers have moved en masse into cities, you know, from farms and agriculture into industry, into factories. And there were such huge changes in the way people worked and lived back then. And of course, it was all technology enabled. You know, it was called the Industrial Revolution after those technologies, but it also had a big cultural impact, a big cultural revolution. So many people living in close proximity. It made newspapers more affordable and able to distribute them to the working classes. It led to the start of the trade union movement. It led to new systems of management, a whole new working practice, and the way that people worked and the expectations they had around work were all established then. Now, we fast forward to today, and we know the world's a very different place, but we've just seen a huge migration out of offices. Millions of workers now working from home. And, you know, we've still got a lot of our old office-based practices that we've just transported into home. And even some of these have, you know, roots in, if you like, management practices from the industrial era. So we're here today to address some of those, to discuss the challenges we're all facing, in this case, with remote working, and what, as leaders, we should really be doing about it. So I'm going to introduce Alex and Lizzie, who are our Hoxby co-founders. If you're welcome to turn your videos on, it's actually one of the principles that we have around Hoxby when we have video calls. So please do, if you can, if your bandwidth allows, turn your videos on and wave and say hello. And let me just hand over to Alex and Lizzie.
Thanks very much, Ben.
Hello.
It's great to see everyone. We love it when we can see your faces. We've done a whole video on having video on and how important it is to feeling like a team. So it's great to see everyone. So actually, Hoxby has been operating in a kind of coronavirus style for a very long time. So just to give you a very quick background on little bit of background about Hoxby. We've been going for 5 years. We are a purpose-led organisation. So everything we do is focused on this vision we have to create a happier, more fulfilled society through a world of work without bias. We're actually pioneering a world of work without bias ourselves, by having 1,000 incredibly talented people working entirely remotely in their own work style, as we call it. So everyone within Hoxby can work where and when they choose. And we sometimes joke we're kind of a social experiment because we are testing this new way of working. But in doing so, we're also working with some of the biggest companies in the world, like Unilever, AIA, Merck, Warner Brothers, Amazon, etc. So we are producing refreshing work through our diverse teams for those big clients in doing so. But we're also learning along the way. And with coronavirus, what we found is we've actually been practicing a lot of the behaviors that suddenly everyone moving to remote working is now asking and seeking to understand more than ever before. And Alex can talk a bit about what we're doing as a consequence.
Thanks, Lizzie, and hi, everyone. Yes, so when news of coronavirus broke, obviously we weren't really sure how this would play out, but we did understand the strategy around social distancing, and we did agree and align to the idea that remote working can be a really big factor in our ability to fight COVID-19 as a collective community. So what we decided to do was start a campaign hashtag remote against coronavirus with a view to collating and curating the best of the advice from around the world on how to do remote working well. So that hashtag has kind of gained momentum. There's been lots of different organizations that have contributed to that. And one of the things that we've evolved that into is a kind of, I think, content plan, but also articles that relate to the 4 stages that the government in the UK is going through, and that's mirrored across Europe in tackling coronavirus. So contain, delay, research and mitigate are the kind of 4 stages that we're kind of going through as we combat coronavirus. And what we wanted to do was make sure that our advice and the curated advice coming out of the campaign was helping companies at each of those 4 stages. So helping organizations adapt as the crisis evolves. So that's what we're doing over the course of the campaign. We've got articles that we are releasing along that structure, and we'll be hosting webinars like this to discuss those articles in more depth. And we've got 1 a week now for at least the next 4 weeks. Hopefully with more to come, depending on how long it goes on for. So that's our campaign, and hopefully you found it useful, and that's why you're here. But you know, if there's any questions about what we're doing, or if you'd like to offer a suggestion of what we should cover, or something that you haven't heard of yet, let us know.
We should also just say that we think this way of working is awesome. We've been enjoying this under very different circumstances for the last 5 years, and we know that the catalyst for this is a crisis, but it's actually a brilliant, brilliant way to work. And hopefully you'll see that enthusiasm come through as we talk through the content today.
Brilliant. Thanks guys. Thanks for the welcome. So this first webinar is on remote leadership. We wrote a quite detailed piece with 5 rules for remote leaders, and as well as Alex and Lizzie here, we've got Adrienne Sale, who is the Managing Director of Hoxby HR, and Joanna Wong as well, who is a chartered psychologist who's been working with leaders for the last 15 years doing very in-depth psycho profiling of them, and they're both going to bring lots of practical tips from how we've been working with clients, but also how we've been working within Hoxby on remote leadership. And so we're going to dive into that. If that's okay, we're going to spend about 15 or 20 minutes now drawing out some of the key points, some lessons, some stories for you, and then please feel free to share all of your questions, and we'll have about 25 minutes of questions at the end. So sounds good. Anyone who's just joined, please do turn on your video. Please do respond to the poll that we've got going. Please do share in the chat any other points and things that you want to raise, and we'll pick those up and fire them to the panelists as we go. So I will start with Joanna Wong. Our first question is around rule 1, which was, we talked about not being paranoid as leaders, and it's really difficult when we're remote leaders not to be paranoid. So could you talk to me, why is trust, so important in effective remote leadership, and what as leaders do we need to do to actually build this?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this question in 2 halves. So if we take the first part, why is trust so important in remote leadership? Well, I think a good way to sort of think about the importance of trust is to go back and think about the research that we've done as Hoxby to try to work out what makes really great virtual leadership, because from the very inception of Hoxby, the whole business has lived or died depending on whether or not it's had good leadership. There's always been that introspective interest in us as an organisation and what it is that the likes of Alex and Lizzie need to be doing as virtual leaders to be effective. So we've got information that comes from within Hoxby about what we think is important in virtual leadership. And then we've also gone out and we've looked at the research in virtual leadership and tried to find what are the common threads in the research that suggest are important areas that leaders need to attend to if they're going to be successful in this space. And then we've also looked at best practice from industry and from other consultancies as well. And it's really interesting because when you look across all of those different sources, one thing stands out, and that is this theme around trust. So trust comes through time and time again in the literature in terms of being a strong predictor of team effectiveness in remote teams. And it also comes out from our own lived experience in Hoxby, as well as it being something that's been critical to the success of making this model stick. So trust really matters. And I think now that many of us and many organisations have had to move to remote, probably initially it's easy as a leader to feel a level of paranoia because we don't have the usual ways of judging whether people are engaged or not. We can't see them at their desk. We can't just check in. So as a leader, it is quite possible to become paranoid unless you put in place strategies that are going to enable you to create trust for yourself. It's also possible that employees are going to feel more suspicious and less comfortable because they don't have the usual sources that they can go to for information. They're trying to infer tone from email communication, perhaps more than they would when they could have gone and checked their suspicions by having a face-to-face interaction with someone. So it's more important than ever to address trust. The literature tells us so, and therefore we've got a few kind of simple tips from Hoxby's lived experience to hopefully bring to life what you as leaders could be doing to build trust. So we're going to share some tips. I should say though that I think given where we all are emotionally around coronavirus and the volume of information that's out there, there is a lot of material out there, isn't there, around here are 10 different ways of leading and here are all the tips. And I recognise that not everyone might emotionally be able to take all of this on board just yet, because ultimately a bit of self-care is important first. Looking after our own emotional state is likely to be the first step in building effective leadership in this environment. But hopefully as people settle into this new way of working, these kind of tips and practical things you can be doing will become more useful and helpful. So what are the things that we as Hoxby have uncovered as good trust building strategies? So the first one is around having a few mandatory rules around communication. So what do we mean by that? Well, in Hoxby, what that looks like is us using a single platform for interaction. So in our business, that means that we use Slack. That means it got people away from email and it creates transparency where people can see conversations and have visibility. So it's really important because that means that people are in conversations and they're involved, and you don't have multiple proliferation across different platforms of side conversations and sub conversations and information that's hidden. So having the right technology is a massive enabler of creating trust. And I think obviously not every organisation right now will be in a position to move wholesale to one new platform, but I think what we would encourage is that you try to avoid excessive proliferation, where you've got multiple different places where lots and lots of different conversations are happening, rather than having one place where there's a higher level of transparency. There are also then some really good tricks and tips about how you engage with any platform that you do choose to put in place, in terms of having standard hashtags that you might use, or standard emojis or pins, and conventions around people how might behave within the platform that are pretty important as well. So it's pretty practical to think about the technology, but we do think it creates a good platform for creating trust because it gives you that visibility and transparency in the architecture that you've built. A second tip is around using video communication wherever possible. So in Lizzie's intro, she mentioned that, and obviously we've encouraged you all to use video. I think increasingly there's a need for a human touch, and audio allows people to be one more step removed. Video is much more present, and you can read body language more easily. It allows a better read of people's emotional engagement in a given situation, and all of that is helpful in building trust. video is for what we might do in our day-to-day meetings, but video is also the mechanism that leaders often need to become comfortable with in a virtual environment, in terms of using set piece video for communication of messages. And what we mean in Hoxby by doing that is not highly polished, highly edited, glossy content. Sorry, Lizzie and Alex. What we mean is real stuff. So we don't edit heavily. We do make mistakes. We do show people the outtakes, and we don't do unduly sort of static, highly corporate feeling types of communications that are highly scripted, because we think that, again, for building trust and authenticity and engagement, is really important to be human in the way that we use video. Some of the things we've done in Hoxby, which have been wild successes, have been our Christmas Secret Santa initiative, where we've had Hoxbys all over the world via video, not only interacting via video, but using simple techniques around all opening gifts at the same time. So there's something powerful in a common action that people need to undertake whilst you're on video, which can be really helpful in building a level of kind of connection. So as much as everyone eating the same biscuits on a call might sound trite, but actually it can be quite powerful in creating engagement.
Can I just make a comment, Jo, on that?
Yeah, sure.
Is that all right? So
yeah.
Just to speak from first-hand experience, so Lizzie and I, when we first started doing videos and deciding to record videos as a way to communicate to the Hoxby community, we would spend quite a long time crafting what we were going to say, and in fact we'd script it, and then we would film probably, I'm sure you don't mind me saying this, Lizzie, but probably 5 to 10 different takes to get to what we wanted to, and in the end it was rubbish, and the realization was that we were overthinking it and trying to present something that was kind of too polished, and actually in so doing we lost the real value of the video, which was the authenticity. So we had to kind of teach ourselves not to do that, and to just have 2 or 3 bullet points that we know we need to cover, and then just let the rest come naturally. And that is a skill. It takes practice, and it feels weird at first, but it's something that we're trying to teach leaders within Hoxby to do really well, because if you can get yourself into the habit of doing it, it's actually a very efficient and effective way to communicate.
Yeah, and we'll come on to the personal kind of element of what that builds as well a little bit, if that's all right, because really interesting. Perhaps we'll move on to a next question, because actually we're talking a lot about building trust and building teamwork, but also, as leaders, we're thinking about how do we really remain, productive. We've got all this stuff going on. We've got real business pressures probably on the organization as well. So Adrienne, I'll bring you here. Like, how as a remote leader do you drive productivity, if you like, at a time like this?
Yeah. So I think in the same way that if I was supporting you in an office role, I would be saying the same advice on a remote, that we need to, instead of measuring on the time at the desk, be measuring on the deliverables. So that's having a mindset as a leader of shifting, how do we measure productivity in the way that we can see what's being delivered? And how do we enable that productivity by being available for our employees to do the work that they need to do? In these times, I think what's really important to acknowledge as leaders is that we cannot expect the same productivity that we would have expected in a previous era. And we need to start to shorten our goals to saying, what can you get done today? And what can you get done this week? Versus what can you get done this month and this quarter? And when we shorten those goals, we help to improve the mental well-being of our employees, because they can see that they're achieving something regularly and they're contributing. But what's really important on the productivity front is so much valuable thinking doesn't always happen at the desk. And in fact, this time and allowing people the space to go out and garden when the sun's shining or cook a meal means that they might come up with some really creative responses that they wouldn't have come up with had they been tied to their desk. And physically releasing ourselves from our desk workspace and allowing us to do things with our hands and our minds means that we're still thinking about things in the back of our head, and we're coming up with problems and solutions. And I personally have this happen to me all the time. And if you have a chat with me, I'll say, you know, I was driving and I thought of this. Or whilst I was cooking, I came up with a solution and I knew that was the solution I needed to deliver. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if I was at my desk. So there's a real shift in acknowledging that this comes up with a different way of productivity. And we know that,
Adrienne,
right? Yeah.
Can I just chip in that I've actually had coronavirus the last week, and I've done some of my best Hoxby thinking from my bed. Because though I haven't been working, what I have been doing is spending a lot of time just mulling stuff over, and actually probably got some bigger picture perspective than I normally would. And I think it's just an example. I normally would say that pre-coronavirus world, I used to swim 3 times a week, and I used to, my time in the pool was by far my most productive time of the week, because it was when I did my best thinking. But even being poorly in bed, probably not at the peak of it, but at the beginning and the end, gave me some real headspace to think about things and think about them in a different way. And I think that's just one example of
absolutely. And there is something about releasing yourself into doing something different that allows the mind to work through things subconsciously. And it's really important to acknowledge that although they might not be sitting at the desk responding to emails, you're actually having some really interesting productivity time that you might not would have had if they were having to sit at the desk from 8 to 5. Mm-hmm. But I think right now, as Joe was saying, it's so important for leaders to understand that there's going to be different needs for different individuals, and productivity being measured by output versus being measured by the time at the laptop is so important. And making that shift means that your team members can attend to what they need to attend to, because let's face it, if they haven't fed the kids, if they haven't gotten their elderly parent going on what they need to, their mind is not going to be focused, and you're not going to get good productivity anyway.
It's probably worth just adding in about work style here, which is central to the very existence of Hoxby, which is around that meritocracy that Adrienne talks about there, that judging people on their output rather than where and when they work frees people up to work in the way that makes them most productive. So we have lots of creatives at Hoxby. We know lots of them like to work late into the night and stay in bed till midday. Who are we to judge on that? It shouldn't matter. What matters is that they work in the way that is best for them. And I think that's never been more important than now. I have 3 young children, and I know lots of people are juggling family as well. I'm working evenings, and a number of people have said to me, you're working evenings. I've actually always worked Friday evenings because I don't go out much, and I've got 3 young kids. So don't judge me on that. Now no one's going out. That might be more normal, but I've always done that. So I think it's about what you're delivering, not where and when.
Absolutely. And in a typical workplace, just let me make this one final point. In a typical workplace where this is new, add a tagline to your emails that says, I'm responding when it's convenient to me. I expect you to reply to me when it's convenient to you. And start giving that permission to your employees and your colleagues and your managers that this is when it's right for me, and I don't need something back until it's right for you.
Yeah. Or as we have in Hoxby, if your status, if you can share that in Teams or Slack or whatever it is, when you're available. That's because one of the things we do is we might well do our emails or do our best work thinking on a Friday night or in the evening or at the weekend. But we haven't very well learnt to go to the movies on a Tuesday afternoon. That's like the quote from Ricardo Semler, one of the great kind of leaders in this. And that's the problem, is that we're actually, because we've seen this big blend of work and life and everything kind of in the home now, how do we make that balance? And so that's my next question is to you, Joanna. Like, how do we avoid this like always on, always replying to emails, that type of culture?
Yeah, and I think I've seen that sort of happening in some of the client organisations I've been working in, where there's a real challenge at the moment, where there are some people who, because they feel almost that they would work every hour in the day because there's no longer a natural boundary that's been imposed. And I think it's a real challenge to help look after the well-being of those people who now may have a much more blurred boundary. And I think a lot of this does again come back to work style, which is to say it's therefore really important to help have more explicit conversations with people about what their work style now is, and to get good data. So whether that means surveying employees and understanding how their ability to contribute may or may not have shifted, and how they now want to work might be a valid thing to do, and certainly is something that we've done in the Hoxby community, a very quick survey, but something that has enabled people to reflect back to us as an organisation how they want to work now and how their work style has shifted. And then I think on a really practical level, a couple of things that do help are setting statuses, as you say, or if we're not in a Slack environment, just on email footers, having work style in there. So people getting used to being explicit about what their working pattern is, or the times where they might be on or off, so that it's more understood. The other thing that I think has worked well in Hoxby was that very early on in the coronavirus crisis, we introduced I think Alex and Lizzie came up with the idea of having a little juggler emoji that you could put next to your status to signal if you were kind of in the throes of it all. But there was also a hands up status that people could use if they felt that they did want to pitch in and help and they had additional capacity and time. And there's also quite a scary looking coronavirus green blob emoji that you can put on your status if you're afflicted. But I think all of these things sound trite, but are very helpful. We talk about, signs and symbols in culture change and how important they are, but creating some new signs and symbols in organizations that people can use to signal where they're at, I think is really valid and helpful. I think the other thing about always on as well is that as leaders, the shadow that you cast is a strong one. And so if you're setting an always on culture by your behavior, then that will be mirrored back to you in the rest of the organization. And again, something I do see Lizzie and Alex doing quite regularly is challenging on work style. So they'll be, holding themselves to account in relation to, are they doing something within work style? But they'll often say to someone else, is this within your work style? Have you thought about, is this the right thing for you right now? So there's active challenge and role modeling. The thing with leading by example is we sort of know that that's what we should all do as leaders anyway, because that's good leadership. But in this environment, one of the things that will predict how well we can lead by example is how well we're self-regulating our own emotional state. And if we're all a bit more stressed than we were a month ago, our ability to control our behaviors and to lead by example may be not as high as it was before. So this again comes back to that idea of self-care first. Looking after your own emotional regulation as a leader is pretty important if you were to then be well controlled in the leadership example that you set.
And we're talking, some of these things, they sound quite small, don't they? It sounds like, just setting an emoji or setting this thing, but actually we're talking about quite big behavior change, away from like a 9 to 5 or whatever hours that you would normally work in an office, and also perhaps, the way that you would work together and expect people to reply to you. So it's quite big change. So Adrienne, how do you actually, especially at a time of crisis, how do you get people to adopt the changes that you want to see as a leader?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost is acknowledging that, we're all feeling a little bit unusual right now, and your teams will be too. And that we need to lean into that anxiety. And I was speaking to my son's class about how do we live the school's values in the workplace. And I was so excited to say that I do it at Hoxby all the time. I was trying to tell them that, you go through something, a change, you feel kind of, really acknowledging that, even if you can't put a word to what you're feeling, put a mood, a face expression. And when you can lean into that yourself and help your team lean into that, then you can start to move forward and you can start to explore the what ifs and what could it be. And then again, building on what Joanna says, it's about that leading by example and being honest and vulnerable and saying, today's not a great day for me, but I'm still going to move forward and I'm still going to try to do other things. And I think that resilience is going to come from tackling into that change, and exploring it is going to mean that we're going to be better at the end versus not denying that it's actually happening. I think if anyone in your team is saying they're not feeling uncomfortable, they're not actually acknowledging what's going on. This is a global pandemic. This is a scary thing. None of us have ever lived through this. We don't know what it means. We don't know for how long this is going to be there. And this should make us feel uncomfortable. We should feel weird about it. So I think on a positive, how do you turn that around as a leader? You can talk to them about the different ways of working. They could write things down, how they can share, how they communicate. You could put in calls regularly with them every day. A leader on one of my clients is doing that as well. Every day they're calling their whole team members. How are you feeling today? What's going on? You know what's right in your organization. Put those touch points in there. Try not to be too tech focused. Remember that Barbara in accounts might not be familiar with all of this technology. Don't leave Barbara behind just because you want to use a really fancy technology that you know. Help to bring her with you. And we're setting up a fantastic project for Merck today, this past week. And I've got some team members who are newer to Hoxby. And I said, don't let the tech get in the way. I have you here because I love what you think and I love how you produce. And let me help you with the tech, because I can help you with that stuff. So just bring that thought all the way through in your teams and what you're working with. And try to use terminology that people recognize. Things like, we'll see you at the water cooler, or can I have a water cooler chat? Or this is a boardroom chat. We have some unbelievably fantastic conversations in Hoxby around the water cooler and on Netflix, and sharing those, what are we enjoying? And I think that brings that human element to the workplace that could be missing for some people.
Just to add something in that Adrienne kind of touched on there, I think written communication in this way of working, when you have disparate work styles, takes on a whole new level of importance. And writing to connect and inspire is a different form of written communication from writing to simply functionally get things done. And that involves a certain level of empathy and taking the time to write things down that you otherwise might not. And I find that all the time in the Hoxby Slack, that I end up writing, keeping messages short is actually a very important part of leadership, I think, in this model, and of making things not feel overwhelming. But I think in terms of writing to empathize with people and being able to, another thing that we talk about within our kind of virtual leadership consulting framework is about listening without hearing, because in this model, it's just not possible to be talking to everyone all the time. So you need to be listening through written communication and playing that back to people to show that you empathize and understand, which is a completely different aspect of leadership that may never have been needed before you move to a remote leadership model.
Yeah.
Can I also make a point, if that's okay, about work style? So I think one of the big challenges with this way of working is the shift for people to make from being kind of told when and where to work to being free to choose when and where to work, albeit we aren't as free as we might be in this current climate.
Has to be at home.
But it puts a pressure on people to be accountable to themselves about when they're working. And work style is a really great way of having that conversation, which is about saying, look, it's not up to me to tell you when to work. It's up to you to decide that for yourself. And you need to work that out on the basis of what you have on your plate. I can't tell you what that is in terms of I know roughly what it is in terms of your workload, but I have no appreciation for what else is going on in your life right now. So I think work style is a really great language to use to make clear that actually this is a shift in behavior for us all that moves from being told to being self-accountable and to holding ourselves against our work, which is the big behavior change that comes from working this way versus working in a kind of very traditional office-based employed way.
Yeah.
Well, the one final point on this, and then we're going to open up to some questions, because actually, Alex and I, we were discussing, and we said it's amazing how, because now that you've got time to perhaps craft a message, you actually get people sharing and being a bit more vulnerable and more open, and probably also different people than who traditionally in the office might have been more open about themselves and more personable. So it actually enables you as a leader to build these more real, more personal, more authentic kind of connections as well, doesn't it? Like in terms of
Absolutely.
everyone that you've probably realised that across Hoxby. And
Yeah.
My favourite thread on Hoxby is the one where it's the one bad thing and three good things, and it's been going on for weeks, and everyone's saying, because we're all having bad times, everyone's saying, I've had a horrendous day because of this, but actually it was okay, and we brought it back to being great because I've had these three small wins. And it's so lovely to see it, like mine don't really matter, like I've had my day, but it's so lovely to see how other people are getting through their tough times. And it really does start conversations. You have direct messages, we've spoken about things in different chats saying like, how is it going? So it really does start conversations that I think are really needed, especially at the moment.
Yeah, especially that little wins thing. I think is really nice. Like if you share your little win, I would never, personally in the office, go, "Oh, I had this little win the other day. Thanks, thanks. Could I just get a thumbs up from 8 people? That'd be great."
That's exactly it, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
That is it. In a remote environment, you don't have to overcome that kind of physical presence awkwardness or the kind of barrier that you sometimes experience at a networking event, or around people that you're not as familiar with. But you can start conversations much more easily, and you can therefore engage with each other in a much more kind of one-to-one way than perhaps you ever would have had the opportunity to.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So guys, thanks. I want to thank Adrian, Joanna, Lizzie, Alex so far. We're now completely open floor to questions, challenges you guys have been struggling with, things you've been thinking about in the shower or on a walk or wherever. We do this, I think it's our first one, but try it. If you've got a question, just unmute yourself and ask away, and one of us will try and pick it up and try and answer it. And if not, we'll get back to you after the session. And if you can't unmute yourself because you've got lots of background noise, feel free to type it in the chat and I can read it out. So the floor is yours, guys. I will look out for anyone raising a hand, or feel free to just jump in. Was that anyone raising a hand there? Was that Jacob?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So Matt Mayer from Taylor Winters. One of the challenges we've had is adapting to a different delegation style. So we've seen a very strong shift through to senior people holding on to work because it's more difficult to delegate to more junior people. So appreciate that, maybe a function of organizational structure, but wondered if you had any thoughts or tips on delegation.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for your question, Matt. Adrian, I can see you nodding. Is that, or Lizzie's leaning forward?
I'm happy to chip in as well. No, I was just going to say that I think that it goes back to trust for me as well. That part of what I think is particularly interesting about trust is that everyone starts a relationship with swift trust. And forgive me if you're all familiar with this framework. But then when you reinforce it with trustful actions, you then have earned trust. And I think it's almost remembering about that swift trust. Remember to trust people until they fail in some way. And in that case, you need to make the right interventions. And that's a cultural thing that starts at the top. Because if you can, and I've had my own battles with delegation because I also like high levels of control. I am always concerned that the Hoxby brand represents itself brilliantly. But what I found is that actually there are 1,000 incredibly talented people in this community who actually are way better than me at the thing that they do. Way better. All I know about is starting and leading this kind of business. What I don't know about is doing the doing that they're way better at than me. And when you see that happen, it reinforces that positive behavior and you feel like you can do it again. But again, it goes back to showing that you've done it and showing so that other people understand that it is happening elsewhere, it can be done and it can deliver exceptional work. The other thing I'd say is about we never give things to individuals. At Hoxby, people don't work on their own. They always work in, as a minimum, a pair. And that really helps because it means that firstly, they've got someone to bounce ideas off, but also you've got someone to catch you if you fall, you've got someone to flag if there's an issue, or you've got someone to cover if you get coronavirus, for example, or one of your children does. So it's particularly beneficial at the moment to pair people up or bring them together in carefully curated teams to make sure that you confidently can empower them to deliver an output together.
Yeah. I think, sorry, can I just add a point, Adrian? Sorry, we're all going to have a view on this, I'm sure. One of the things that we try to implement at Hoxby is a mentality around self-serve as well. So it's not about necessarily somebody saying, here is this task, I'd like you to do it in a sort of traditional delegation way. It's about saying, here's what we need to achieve as a team, as a business. And making that visible to as many people as possible and saying, how do you recommend we go about it? Who's available to take it on? Who wants to take it on? Who's excited by this? How would you do it differently? And almost put the power into the hands of the individuals to say, actually that's right up my street and where I think I can really help, and I've got capacity to do it, rather than us kind of assuming we have to make that decision all the time. So operating in a remote environment gives us a much greater platform through which to do that, and to break down some of the hierarchies that we might be familiar with from our traditional working.
The only other thing I would, oh, sorry, Adrian.
That's okay. I was just going to ask, where do you sit in relation with the people who aren't trusting? So are you coaching them? Are you on their team?
Well, I'm personally leading an organization, so I'm leading a group of leaders.
Okay.
So my role is, I guess, trying to find the right frameworks and methodologies for the leaders to think about when they're leading their teams.
Yeah. So you've been given some really great examples on how to try to shift that mindset and challenge them and saying, why are you having a hard time trusting? What is there? And how can you start to take steps to trust and to release some work? Because actually when they do, they're going to feel so much better in themselves. It feels so much better to coach others into doing the work. And that could be because what they've seen that's gotten them to this position, they're not recognizing it's not what's going to take them to the next place. It's what's going to hold them back. And they have that big mind shift that has to happen from individual contributor to midline leader to a senior leader that still is managing with them. So I think it sounds like they might be reverting back to some behaviors that got them to where they go. These are the behaviors that they knew that got me there. And so you are tasked with saying they're not the ones that are going to keep us going in the future.
Brilliant. Right, great. Matt or Joanne, go on.
I was just going to, no, I'll be brief. It was the only thing I would add, sort of with my psychologist's hat on, is to say that I think delegation and trust are kind of seamlessly interwoven, but often the emotion that is going on underneath the reason why someone isn't trusting and isn't delegating is anxiety. So if there's heightened general anxiety, then what you might be seeing as well is that kind of retrenchment back to holding on to stuff as a sort of defense mechanism, which is more likely to be present in this environment where emotion and anxiety is heightened. So as a leader, if that's what's going on, it's all about then trying to be a reassuring presence and creating clarity where you can to hopefully reduce some of that latent anxiety, which may enable people to let go a little bit better as well.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Does that give you some good input there, Matt? Thumbs up. Fantastic. Thanks very much. Any other questions then from the floor? Please feel free. Come and unmute yourself. Introduce yourself. Tell us where you're coming from.
Hello. So my name's Jacob. I run a co-working business. And so we've just made the transition online with our community. We have like 0 revenue currently as our core services stopped. We're looking at potentially doing an online community, but that's kind of first we just want to establish what that would be. On this question of trust, we've just trusted ourselves to almost take a step back from the leadership position and let the community almost, we just need a little bit of a break and let the community kind of take charge of itself. A few people have stepped up to the mark and started to kind of almost lead themselves, and we've sort of allowed that trust to just let that happen. So my question to you guys is, how do you sort of support and reward members of a community or a team or an organization that do go above and beyond and do step into leadership roles when there is a vacuum of leadership?
Great question. Thanks, Jacob. Brilliant.
I think hopefully every organisation is looking to create a whole community of leaders, and they may have their own style, but in terms of proactivity, what we're looking for at Hoxby, we have a 25% profit share that everyone benefits from, whether they're doing paid work or not, and we want that sense of ownership and empowerment for everyone to see changes that need to be made and to make them. And it's funny because Joe talked earlier about some of the small changes that we think are really important from a cultural perspective, and to talk about a couple more in terms of both channels for people to suggest things and also recognition for when they do. We have something called the Always Improving form. Always Improving is one of our values. Our values are explicit hashtags that hopefully are quite self-explanatory in terms of what they are. Our Always Improving form has had, I think, 536 suggestions over the last 3 months, just to give you an idea of how many ideas we're getting from all around the community, from different people. And that gives them a place where they know that they can put things, and then we're making a budget available for people to be able to then act on those ideas. So that's one way of kind of us centralizing ideas, because with a community as big as ours, what you have to do is have some process around these things. The other thing that we have had since inception is what we call Hoxby Hero, which is a weekly award. And as many people can get it as are nominated for it. You have to be nominated for living one of our 6 values. And we thought to begin with it was kind of just a small thing. It's got its own silly emoji of someone with a cape on flying, being a hero. But actually people love it. It makes their week when they're Hoxby Hero. And praise and recognition is so important, and something that actually you can do very easily in the tangible, in real life world. But I think people sometimes forget it when they translate to an online environment. And we talk as part of our proprietary future-proofing model about purpose, culture and structure. And I think at a time like this, a lot of people are thinking about structure, or certainly in that initial phase of responding to the crisis. But actually it's the cultural change that we think will unlock the true success that comes from working this way. And small things like the Always Improving Form or the Hoxby Hero once a week, those things make an enormous difference to people feeling like, firstly, they're able to input in a productive way, and also like they're getting recognised for what they are doing, and also positive reinforcement for what is the right thing to do and living the right behaviours.
Yeah, I think it might also just be worth mentioning about how, you know, like people like Adrienne, you're basically building a business, right? Like Hoxby HR, and that whole kind of model is slightly different to a more traditional hierarchy, if you like, where like MDs are then empowered to go and build a business and take complete kind of responsibility for that, take risk, but also have reward on the same side. And I think that risk and reward probably is quite an interesting one. I don't know if that's a point Alex or Adrienne maybe or Lizzie could kind of pick up about how we actually go about that, just in terms of a more macro scale thing.
Yeah. So yes, so it's real funny to say leading a business, yes, but actually I feel like I'm just pulling great minds together to produce a wonderful solution. So it feels like it's just more of a just a corraller.
Mm-hmm.
A corraller and a designer.
I think, yeah, and I think the thing with these things is that they don't happen overnight as much as we might want them to. And to Jacob's question, you know, I think, as Lizzie says, positive reinforcement of the behaviours you want to see and the direction that's being set by the individuals who are taking leadership is the way to go, but takes time. And you know, the kind of cultural expectation and the direction comes from doing that over a sustained period. So I think a little bit of patience on behalf of the leader is kind of required there, just to let that kind of evolve, but by constantly rewarding the right behaviours and informing the direction through your support of it, or the narrative you put around it, is kind of, I think, the best way to get to that end, which is what we see our MDs doing. People like
and you know, Ben's point, I think, is the kind of live manifestation of that we do believe that if you put the right parameters around it, then you can create the conditions where people can thrive in their own way within the collective whole. And I appreciate we're at a very extreme end of the spectrum, because what we're basically creating is this community from where these businesses can rise. But that, I think we're completely aligned with you, Jacob, in terms of the principle of put it back to the community, provide the right framework around it, and it's absolutely staggering what you can achieve as a consequence of that.
Yeah.
Right, great. Thanks, Jacob, for your question. I was get some input there. Thanks very much. Anyone else? We've still got another 10 minutes or so. Probably time for 2 or 3 more questions. Yeah.
Hi.
Hey.
Okay, I'll have a go. Hi, I'm Aliki, and I'm leading a marketing team. And I was wondering if you had any tips around encouraging team or cross-team collaboration, because I'm finding that, you know, members in my team are starting to work a little bit more in silos. So I was really wondering if you had any tips around that.
Brilliant. I'm sure there's lots.
Yep. I've got one, and I think I hate to go back to tech again, but I think transparency of the right tech is really important here. So for us, Slack has been the perfect tool for this, and I know that lots of people are moving more into Microsoft Teams. But having transparency across those different groups will save you needing to be the bridge. I sometimes think that as a leader, your job should be to inspire, set the strategic direction, lead, not to be communicating constantly and toing and froing between other people. And certainly this is something we found when we very first started. We had Slack and we had email. And actually we got to a point where we said, we have a no email policy here. And we got that quite quickly. Everyone has to use Google Suite documents so that everyone can collaborate, everyone on the project team can see. And for us, moving to that complete transparency has been really important from a tech perspective. I think the other thing at a more strategic level is motivating everyone towards a shared objective, that if you're very clear and relentlessly reiterate what that shared objective is, then naturally you find the team coming together behind that objective, because they aren't able to operate in silos as much, because they understand that ultimately success means achieving that, and they can't get to that without each other.
Something we've talked about, sorry, Adrienne.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, something we've talked a lot about in Hoxby as it's evolved as well, is this idea of inadvertently creating in and out groups. So allowing small groups to splinter off, which can be unhelpful in terms of the culture that you're trying to create. And being, as Lizzie says, this idea of aligning people behind what's called a supraordinate goal is the solution to that, at least in terms of what we've seen in the psychology literature as well. So yeah, the idea of supraordinate goals and clear alignment to a sense of mission and purpose, and clarity over what that is often a helpful strategy to sort of reforge teams back together who might have started to splinter apart.
I think that it's the in-group out-group dynamics thing is so fascinating, Aliki, because you might think what you're looking to create is small, highly bonded teams, but actually in doing so, you can create this quite toxic in-group out-group dynamic. And it's something that, you know, Joe's been very interesting talking to Alex and I about the theory, which perfectly correlates with some early experiences that we had at Hoxby, where we saw this in practice, that if you make a small team feel too special in themselves, what you'll find is that they protect themselves and they don't let others in. Whereas actually to get to the best solution, you're looking to make the whole wider team feel joined up behind a single objective. And actually, I think that also plays a bit into what Matt's question about delegation, that if you can make sure that everyone feels part of one whole rather than a special part of a smaller group, then that makes a massive difference.
And I think when you build that on the objectives, as part of the objective of the work, you are saying, my expectation as team leader, as manager, is that you are collaborating and that you have insight from other teams. You are setting that expectation that you are not to be siloed. And if you keep encouraging that, did you ask them from that team what their input is on this? And how did that influence your decision? You start creating a culture of them knowing we can't silo, we can't have the in-group, we can't be the small group. So set that in your objectives when you start a project, or when you are setting your annual or now weekly objectives. Put that in there and be really explicit. You need to get input from other people, and I can't wait to see how you build together to create this.
I think as well as a leader, you do also have to accept that if you're going to take that approach, which is probably the right approach a lot of the time, there's a trade-off with speed. So it might not always be the fastest, but if it helps you get in the right direction, it's faster in the long run. But in the short term, you also have to accept that there's probably a small trade-off to be made there. Should we move on? Well, take another question for the floor. Thanks very much, Aliki. Thanks for your question.
I'll just make an extra point on that, Ben, while we source that question, which is just about, as a leader, the need to what we talk about is over communicate. So it's being highly transparent. If it feels slightly uncomfortable, then it's probably right to share it, because I think in a remote environment, you're not privy to passive conversation, and therefore you rely on being surfaced with information, and you don't necessarily consume it all either. So as leaders, if we want people to understand what's going on, we have to consciously give them that information, and hopefully that leads to behavior among everyone else in the community to do the same. So to be overt in sharing information, which helps to build trust and helps to bring everybody behind the same objective as well.
Brilliant. Right, we're going to have time for, I think, one more question, possibly two.
I think Nicola had a question.
And we've got a question in the chat as well.
Oh, yeah. Nicola, did you have a question?
Oh, which Nicola? There's two of us on the call.
Yes, it's you.
Yeah, okay, yeah, no, I did. Yeah. So I really was just going to reiterate what Alex was saying. I think a lot of times that companies talk a really good game and talk about, you know, people are our most valuable resource. But when times get hard, that's when, you know, the reality shows itself. So it's the long game that we're working towards. It is actually, you know, sort of reinforcing and sort of modeling behavior, but all the time, not just when times are good. And
Nicola, this has been so on my heart, so passionately on my heart, that how we behave and how we treat each other now will determine if we have a workforce in 12 to 18 months. Mark my word, the companies that don't find a way to be human and empathetic will be facing a big exodus of people when things settle down. And this is our time. I get goosebumps thinking about it. It's our time to be the most human, to be the most empathetic to one another, and just to get down to those very basic levels.
We've got one more question, Ben, that was asked in the chat about basically about work style ghosting, where someone just doesn't turn up for a day, doesn't turn up for a Zoom. This goes back to the point we made about understanding what people's work styles are. So at Hoxby, we asked people to put in their status either when they'll next be working or what their overall work style is for that week. And I think understanding what everyone's work style is really important to understand whether something actually quite concerning might have happened to that individual, or whether that's just expected because they weren't intending to be working then anyway. It is really hard working in this environment where you are relying on people to communicate with you. There's nothing you can do. You can't go over to their desk if they don't communicate back with you. And so setting the right macro behaviors in terms of everyone being transparent with their work style is really important in order to be able to understand whether you should be raising the alarm about that individual or whether they're simply having a quiet day or not poorly or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. Guys, I'm going to now just ask for our one kind of key takeaway point. Thank you so much for your questions. We will follow up with you all kind of individually to make sure that those have been answered, and we'll be sharing more stuff as we go. But we're going to have one kind of final piece of takeaway advice from some of our panelists. So, Adrienne, I think you were just mentioning there kind of something you were quite passionate about. What would you like to share with everyone who joined today?
It's a good time to be compassionate and empathetic towards one another. It's not the time to set rules, hard and fast rules about how we have to be. And I think this is stretching us all as leaders. And so, you know, get back to that roots and what's most important truly in this world.
Brilliant. Thanks. Joanna?
Yeah, and I think I would loop back all the way to what you said at the beginning, Ben, about how important it is, a bit like on an aeroplane, to fit your own oxygen masks first in this situation to some extent as a leader. A lot of individuals are dealing with lots of emotion and overwhelm and very varied life circumstances. So a bit of self-care is pretty important if you're to optimize your performance as a leader. You're going to make better decisions and you're going to be in better shape to empathize with people in your organization if you have taken time for some self-preservation in amongst all of this. So that's, you know, thinking about how you're responding to the ambiguity, managing your inner emotions, and thinking about if there are aspects of overload that you're experiencing that you need to tackle. And then my four final things to remember to do are communicate, involve, empathize, above all empathize, and look after emotional energy.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joanna. Alex, Lizzie, kind of any final points before we wrap up?
I would just say this might feel like a scary time with loads of change happening, but this is the future of work. This has always been the future of work, and eventually everyone will work this way. So it's worth getting it right and embedding the right behaviours at this point. And maybe you'll never have to go back to an office, and wouldn't that be a wonderful thing?
I do think that from my perspective, the best thing that we've done at Hoxby is introduce the idea of work style. It's the thing that has enabled everybody to talk on a level about how they're working in remote circumstances. It gives everybody a language with which to do that. and that has fostered a culture of teamwork and of a bond that transcends geographical boundaries.
Brilliant. Guys, thank you so much. Thanks so much to everyone who's joined this and asked questions and got involved and given us kind of your time. Look, this doesn't have to be, if you like, the end. We've got a whole series of these webinars coming up. So from next Friday at the same time, midday UK time, we'll be talking about getting into the differences of why remote working isn't at all working from home. We don't like the phrase working from home.
Not the same.
Not the same thing, and we'll be really getting into that. There's lots more material on hoxby.com/our blog to go and read. We'll be producing some more practical tools and tips and things as well over the next few weeks. And we'll also be following up directly with you guys after this webinar. So hopefully we'll keep the conversation going. We're more than happy to answer any questions kind of one-on-one if you'd like to take that away. So we look forward to keeping the engagement going and hopefully making the best of this situation, as at least 70% of you apparently are. So
amazing.
Great.
Thank you, Ben, for hosting us,
guys.
and thank you all.
Have a great Easter.
Yeah,
Thanks. Happy Easter, everyone.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.